Во время Второй мировой войны США разместили в Гренландии военные базы для защиты от захвата ее нацистами. А после окончания войны Штаты предложили Дании выкупить эти острова. Совсем недавно, по меркам.
We need Greenland for national security and international security. So I think we'll go as far as we have to go. We need Greenland, and the world needs us to have Greenland.
You've probably heard whispers about tensions in the Arctic and seen headlines about Greenland, but today you're going to understand exactly what's happening up there and why the US military is scrambling to relearn how to fight in conditions they've completely forgotten about. And it's more urgent than you could even imagine. But first, so you'd understand better why this is such a crisis, we have to start with the uncomfortable truth. The US military has basically forgotten how to fight in the snow. After the Korean War, where over 30,000 Chinese troops literally froze to death at the Chosin Reservoir, and Marines had to use frozen bodies as sandbags because the ground was too hard to dig. You'd think the military would keep those skills sharp, but no. For the past 2 decades, America has been stuck in the sandbox. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, fighting in deserts where the biggest weather problem was heat, not cold. Meanwhile, Russian forces have been quietly rebuilding dozens of Soviet-era bases inside the Arctic Circle, and they've never stopped training for winter warfare. Now the Pentagon is realizing they have a problem. A big one. The Army just published its first Arctic warfare manual in over 50 years. 50 years. That's how long it's been since anyone thought this was important enough to update. The RAND Corporation and other defense experts are openly saying the US has forgotten how to fight in extreme cold. And Western analysts believe it'll take at least 10 years for America to catch up to Russia's Arctic presence. But here's the thing, 10 years might be longer than we have. Let's talk about what's actually at stake here. Greenland alone is 836,330 square miles, more than 3 times the size of Texas. It sits within 500 miles of the North Pole, with 2/3 of the island inside the Arctic Circle, and beneath all that ice, an estimated 90 billion barrels of oil, 1,669 billion cubic feet of natural gas, and some of the world's richest deposits of rare earth minerals. The stuff you need to make smartphones, electric cars, and military-grade technology. The US currently relies heavily on China for these minerals. Greenland could break that dependency completely. Then there's the Patuxent Space Base, America's northernmost military installation, 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It's one of only 2 Arctic facilities the US uses for satellite and space defense operations. Lose access to that, and the military's space capabilities take a serious hit. And the shipping routes, with climate change melting Arctic ice, yeah, I know, dark irony. The Northwest Passage now cuts 4,300 miles off shipping routes compared to going through the Panama Canal. Whoever controls these routes controls a massive chunk of global trade. Russia already controls 53% of the Arctic coastline. They have 41 icebreakers, 7 of them nuclear-powered. The US has 2 barely functioning icebreakers for the entire country. Putin even labeled Russia the largest Arctic power in a recent speech, and unfortunately, he's not wrong. Now, if you're thinking it's just cold weather, throw on an extra jacket and you're good, you're exactly who the Army's Mountain Warfare School is worried about. Captain Nathan Fry, who runs their training division, says there's this myth among soldiers that cold weather experience is the same as Arctic weather experience. It's not. Here's what actually happens in Arctic conditions. Your GPS stops working because solar storms concentrate around the poles and cause random outages. The lubricants in your rifle thicken and gum up. The metal and plastic components get so brittle they can literally shatter. Batteries lose massive amounts of capacity, which is a huge problem for thermal optics, communications gear, and especially the small drones that define modern warfare. During exercises in Finland, temperatures drop to -40 degrees. Not -40 Fahrenheit or Celsius. At that temperature, they're the same. Your exposed skin freezes in minutes. The sun doesn't rise for days in parts of the Arctic during winter. And then there's the terrain itself. Areas that might be a light hike in summer become completely impassable in winter, while frozen lakes and rivers that were barriers suddenly become highways for vehicles, if you can accurately judge the ice thickness. Get it wrong, and you're looking at a Fort Wainwright situation where an OH-58 Kiowa helicopter sank into soft ground during summer, and the Army had to wait until winter for the ground to freeze solid enough to bring in heavy equipment to pull it out. For the non-nerds, operating in the Arctic isn't like operating anywhere else. it's a completely different battlefield that requires specialized training, specialized equipment, and most importantly, what the new manual calls Arctic determination, a learned confidence that comes from proper training and knowing your gear works in these conditions. The US is now frantically trying to learn from NATO's newest members, Finland and Sweden, who actually know how to fight in this environment. And there's a reason they're good at it. Finland borders Russia and was invaded by the Soviet Union during the Winter War of 1939. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Finns used weather and terrain to hold out for 2 months and inflicted massive losses on the Soviets, losing only 9% of their land in the peace negotiations that followed. They've kept a wary eye on Russia ever since and maintained their Arctic warfare capabilities. Now American soldiers from the 11th Airborne Division, nicknamed the Arctic Angels, are training alongside Finnish troops in exercises like Arctic Forge 25. They're learning to ski with military gear, and before you laugh, skis dramatically increase the speed and carrying capacity of infantry over deep snow and icy terrain. The army liked what they saw so much they started producing their own version as part of an infantry winter kit overhaul. Lieutenant Buckland, a platoon leader who trained with the Finns, was impressed by how fluid their movement was even at -40. The Finns have refined these tactics over decades of preparation for fighting Russia on their doorstep. Meanwhile, the Swedish Subarctic Warfare Center near Boden has been hosting US soldiers and airmen for survival skills training. They're learning crucial things like how to assess ice thickness to determine if infantry or vehicles of different weight classes can cross, and how to account for differences between summer and winter terrain of the same landscape. This is the kind of knowledge you don't get from reading a topographical map. It's the difference between planning a successful operation and sending tanks up icy hills because guys back at HQ assumed it'd be fine. Beyond training, the US is having to modify or replace nearly everything to work in extreme cold. Take the Apache helicopter. Engineers are literally developing skis for it, so it can operate in Arctic conditions. Trucks and Stryker vehicles need heavy-duty antifreeze and special fuel additives. Soldiers get issued Arctic weapon lubricant instead of regular CLP. The Army just adopted the Beowulf cold weather all-terrain vehicle in 2022, a $278 million vehicle initial contract that got expanded by another $68 million for 44 more units in 2024 because they liked it so much. That's lightning fast by military procurement standards. The Beowulf is basically a dual body-tracked monster that can carry 14 passengers or 8 tons of cargo, with a top speed of 65 kilometers per hour. It's fully amphibious without any special preparation, which helps with Arctic swamps and bogs when frozen ground thaws in spring and summer. The first units arrived at the 11th Airborne Division in October 2023, just over a year from contract signing. And then there's the icebreaker problem. Russia has 41 icebreakers. China is building more. The US Coast Guard is finally getting authorization to build new polar security cutters, 460-foot vessels that can operate in both Arctic and Antarctic waters. President Biden authorized $11.8 billion in additional Coast Guard resources last year, including funds to purchase commercial icebreaker designs off the market, while the first 3 new cutters are being built. Because here's the thing, if America wants to bring the full might of the US Navy into polar regions, the country needs ships that can actually get there. And right now, with 2 barely functional icebreakers, it can't. While the US has been playing catch-up, Russia has been busy. Putin addressed American plans for Greenland directly at the 6th International Arctic Forum in Murmansk in March 2025. And his response was interesting.
На самом деле, такие планы у Соединенных Штатов Америки проявились еще в 60-е годы XIX века. Уже тогда американская администрация рассматривала возможность аннексии Гренландии и Исландии.
He gave a history lesson, mentioning the 2 times the US tried to buy Greenland. Once in 1867, right after purchasing Alaska, and again in 1946, when Truman offered $100 million in gold, plus a share of Alaskan oil. Denmark turned him down both times. Trump's been pushing for it again, floating ideas like imposing high tariffs on Danish goods, and even suggesting military action. Putin's response? This is a question that concerns 2 specific countries and has nothing to do with Russia. That's a surprising green light, and it makes you wonder why. The likely answer, Ukraine. By downplaying Greenland, Putin might be signaling he's willing to overlook Trump's Arctic ambitions in exchange for American support, or at least non-interference, in getting what Russia wants in Ukraine. Classic quid pro quo between global powers, but Putin couldn't resist throwing in threats anyway. Just not directed at the US. He called out NATO instead, warning that member countries were turning the far north into a springboard for possible conflicts. He called Finland and Sweden's NATO membership a mistake and promised, "We will respond to all this."
Отрабатывать применение войск в этих условиях, в том числе силами своих новобранцев Финляндии и Швеции, с которыми, кстати говоря, у нас до недавнего времени не было вообще никаких проблем. Сами своими руками зачем-то создают. Зачем? Совершенно непонятно.
He also reminded everyone that the Arctic generates about 7% of Russia's GDP and 11% of its exports, with nearly 2.5 million Russian citizens living and working there. Putin labeled Russia the largest Arctic power, and unfortunately the numbers back him up. Russia has been systematically reinvesting in old Soviet military bases around Murmansk, ramping up Northern Fleet capabilities with new icebreakers, missile systems, and Arctic-specific vehicles. They're bolstering defenses at Wrangel Island, Cape Schmidt, and Kotelny Island, all located just across the Bering Strait from Alaska. The US Department of Defense has noted that Russia's expanding infrastructure could soon allow it to enforce excessive and illegal maritime claims along routes like the Northern Sea Route. Translation: Russia could start dictating who gets to use Arctic shipping lanes. Let's be honest about where this is headed. Even if Putin and Trump work out some kind of behind-the-scenes deal on Greenland and Ukraine, it's temporary at best. The Arctic isn't big enough for both powers to dominate peacefully. There are too many competing interests: natural resources, trade routes, military advantage, and national pride. The US will not allow Russia to control Arctic trade routes and resources. Russia will not back down from what it sees as its sovereign territory and economic lifeline. Both countries are rapidly expanding military infrastructure in the region, trying to outpace each other. History gives us a pretty clear pattern here. When two major powers compete for the same strategic territory with this much at stake, diplomatic solutions have a shelf life. Eventually, someone miscalculates, an incident escalates, and suddenly you're in a conflict nobody really wanted, but nobody knows how to back down from. The new Arctic Warfare Manual stresses working with allies: Canada, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, now Sweden and Finland. The goal is deterrence, presenting a unified front to prevent fighting before it starts. Even just having current ice charts from partner nations provides operational superiority over an adversary relying on satellite data that might be days or weeks old. But here's what keeps defense analysts up at night. Western experts believe it'll take at least 10 years for the US to catch up to Russia's Arctic presence. 10 years of vulnerable positioning while competing for resources and routes that are becoming more accessible every year as ice melts. And the US military is only now, in 2025, publishing its first Arctic warfare doctrine in over 50 years. Soldiers are only now learning to ski again. The Army is only now ordering specialized vehicles. The Coast Guard is only now getting funding for icebreakers that won't be ready for years. Meanwhile, Russia has been preparing for this since the Cold War never really ended up there. They maintained their Arctic infrastructure, their winter warfare training, their icebreaker fleet. Putin's speech made it clear: the Arctic is central to Russia's economy and identity in a way it simply isn't for the United States, at least not yet. The Arctic is becoming the next major flashpoint for global conflict, and the US is dangerously behind, not just in equipment and infrastructure, but in institutional knowledge. An entire generation of military leadership has come up through the ranks fighting in deserts and mountains, but not in conditions where your rifle might shatter from the cold and your GPS randomly stops working. The training with Finnish and Swedish forces is crucial. The new equipment is necessary. The updated doctrine is desperately overdue, but whether it's enough and whether it comes fast enough remains an open question. Because while American soldiers are just now learning to ski with military gear, Russian troops have been doing it their entire careers. While the US Coast Guard is waiting for new icebreakers to be built, Russia's nuclear-powered fleet is already clearing routes and enforcing claims. Putin's temporary flexibility on Greenland shouldn't be mistaken for weakness or disinterest. It's tactical positioning, and once the pieces are in place, once whatever deal exists over Ukraine plays out, the real competition for Arctic dominance begins. The US military knows this. That's why the scramble to catch up is so urgent. That's why the 11th Airborne Division is training at -40 in Finland. That's why the Pentagon is fast-tracking cold weather equipment that would normally take years to procure. They're preparing for a war in conditions they've forgotten how to fight in, against an adversary who never stopped training for it. over territory that could reshape global power dynamics for the rest of the century. And they're hoping 10 years is enough time to get ready. Whether it is or not, we're about to find out.